Welcome to Urban Green Live. I'm your host, John Mandyck, the CEO of Urban Green Council. This is a new program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a zero carbon future. And you get to engage too, because we're going to have live Q&A in just a little bit. Now, today I'm really excited because we're going to go to the other side of the planet to hear about green building and low carbon initiatives in Australia. And I have to tell you, we have the country's leading expert on that. My guest today is Davina Rooney. She's the CEO at the Green Building Council of Australia. Davina, welcome to Urban Green Live. There she is. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, good afternoon to your audience. It's morning here. But I think that's the best introduction I've ever had, John. How delightful.
Well, we're thrilled that you're with us. For our audience, Davina got up very early at 6 o'clock in the morning tomorrow in Australia. So Davina, tell us, how's our morning going to be tomorrow since you're already in it?
Well, it's looking pretty good out there. It's looking pretty good.
Well, we're so thrilled that you're joining us. You know, you're literally on the other side of the world from New York City, but I know there's a lot that we can learn from you and what's happening in Australia. So maybe we should start with, what do you see as the major sustainability trends in Australia right now?
So when we talk in Australia, we really try and anchor ourselves where we see the global mega trends. So the key global mega trends that we sort of step back and look at is obviously carbon, which we're unpacking today. You know, we know that buildings are responsible for 39% of the world's carbon use. Material use, circular economy. People aren't always aware that over 50% of material use is attributable to buildings. So circular economy is really fundamental. And then the third big mega trend that we see is really about people's health and well-being. You know, over 90% of people can't access air that the World Health Organization says is of a reasonable quality standard. And, you know, in Australia, in a big, beautiful place like this, we used to say that that was a global problem, not a local problem. The bushfires of last summer really brought that into really sharp focus for us and made us clear that, you know, health and well-being is absolutely a fundamental for us as it relates to air quality. And the thing that we often find is that these three megatrends are interrelated. In the past, in the sustainability world, we've treated them as being quite discrete. But what we find is you can often use a different pathway to end up at the same place. So an example that I'll give is, it's a lot easier, you know, obviously in different times, not in COVID times, but it's a lot easier to convince a parent that it's really good for their child's health and well-being and their confidence to walk to school rather than being driven there. Now that has a great carbon impact. You end up with the same outcome, but one of them is a far more compelling way to speak to that audience. Or we find when we talk in the developing world, health and well-being is often the gateway issue to sustainability. So we say they're really complex and they're interrelated. But we find that by focusing, you know, we start focusing on the global megatrends, relating them to property in Australia. And then our role, like yours, is to work through which training, which advocacy, which partnerships we bring in locally to bring those elements to life.
So let's talk about the circularity that you mentioned. Can you give us an example where circularity might be working well in Australia, or where you're hoping it will work well?
Yeah, well, and so I'd say there's kind of two streams that, you know, a real circularity focus in sustainability has given us. So I would actually say the first focus is actually put a re-energization into the waste focus that we've had for a very long time, you know, so the reduce, reuse, recycle, which, you know, became less engaging for a time period on a consumer side. I would actually say, you know, so we're seeing really interesting organics work, you know, fascinating work, but on the genuine circularity, one of the airports here, it's quite, you know, they're starting to work with dairies next to them and have a far more engaging closed loop process that they seek to engage with, and they're developing new and interesting partnerships for reusing their waste with farms nearby them, and actually genuinely having different product cycles looking at how they use the assets they have. So a lot of what we're seeing when we talk about circular economy is, you know, at this stage, that first tier, that reimagining embodied carbon that I'm sure we'll unpack later in the conversation, and building the business case for manufacturing to drive hard in that area, which I find really inspiring. But we're starting to see more and more innovative. At the moment, they're quite local, but we're looking to learn from those lessons and sort of seek to scale them.
Great. Well, I mean, you mentioned embodied carbon, and I do want to get into that. So, you know, the idea of embodied carbon, you know, frankly, is still relatively new in the United States. You know, we're looking at kind of at carbon in the first instance and what we can do from a reduction standpoint. But help us, first of all, understand the concept of what embodied carbon is, and then tell me your thoughts on, you know, where you think that issue is going in Australia.
Absolutely. So you're exactly right. Like, operational carbon is upfront, first and center. One thing that we're lucky in Australia is we're starting to see a large number of people committing to net zero carbon in operations. And we'll unpack that later in the discussion. So a lot of people are engaged. There's a lot of focus on efficient buildings powered by renewables, which is progressing quite well. As that's progressing well, people are saying, wow, what are the upfront carbon emissions? And we're starting to refer to embodied carbon emissions as upfront carbon emissions so that it's more accessible to our audience. What's the carbon in the materials? And so the exciting part about that arena is that it wasn't really until in Climate Week last year, actually in New York, where the World Green Building Council launched a seminal piece of literature on embodied carbon, which was really about that these are some of the hardest to abate sectors. But if we're really going to meet the Paris Agreement, we actually have to have a plan for materials. And that looks like a 40% reduction for 2030, and it looks like 100% for 2050. And the aim for that long time horizons is really to set business cases for manufacturing to actually change, because it's far more complex in some of those areas, and they need to invest in a lot of R&D. Although it's very complex in the space of efficient buildings powered by renewables, we have a lot of the technology answers. We're sometimes working through governance, you know, the laws that allow us to do certain things, or exactly how we apply the renewables in different locations and synchronized grids. So technical interfaces, but the fundamental physics is resolved. Whereas in certain cases in embodied carbon, we're still unpacking that. But one of the most exciting things in our market was after we launched that report, started working with manufacturers at scale, we had our first steel member commit to net zero by 2030. And then we had earlier this year, we had one of our partners in concrete launch their first net zero cement line. So the thing that's clear is when there's alignment, and when property owners, consultants, builders are creating a clear pathway or a business case for creating low embodied carbon or low upfront carbon emissions, we can work with our partners in manufacturing to get there.
I love that concept of upfront carbon. I haven't heard it before, but I'm going to use it from now on.
We have a big focus at the moment of being communicable, being clear. One of the things where sustainability has gotten lost in the past is there's so much appropriate and necessary technical complexity that some boring engineers like myself have gotten stuck using these terms that frankly nobody else understands. And so we're making, we have a bit of a plain English rule for 2020. And if you can call it a name that people will actually understand, we're making a very strong attempt to use it, whilst obviously using the appropriate technical terms with our university partners.
That's great. So upfront carbon in concrete and steel, those are, you know, two huge pieces of that carbon profile. But I'm curious, is there a pull yet for this? I mean, are developers asking for it? I mean, what's the level of awareness?
So what I think one of the things that was so important about the Embodied Carbon report last year is that there were global signatories to the pathway, including us, including other councils around the world. And what that means for us is we're setting a carbon positive roadmap where we take these megatrends and say what's going to happen. Now, in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, we run a tool called Green Star, which is the equivalent to your lead. And so what we've done is we've said we're heading this way as a focus area. Then what we're seeking to do is actually mandate that as a minimum in our requirements, that you do 10% better, and that you're doing at least 20% better in our leading standard. So what we're trying to do is create the pull, and then on the advocacy side, we're spending a lot of time with government, and we're actually joint commissioning a report on what policy positions look like on embodied carbon. So look, I think when you're talking about bringing the market to these areas, we talk about the carrot, the stick, and the tambourine. You know, so I think everyone's pretty familiar with the carrot and the stick. But the thing that we've found is to actually make any necessary change, needs to be an organisation like Urban Green as the, you know, as the tambourine, getting everyone excited and engaged about what the possibilities can look like, drawing on global research and bringing it very much into the market. However, I actually think that the time to talk about upfront carbon emissions is when you have some of the fundamentals of operational carbon in hand and some strategies that are really working well in your jurisdiction. So part of the conversation that we're unpacking today in the New York context is what it takes to get operational carbon emissions on track, because I think it's once you actually have those strategies progressing well, that it's really, you know, when operational carbon comes down to zero over a building's life cycle, it becomes incredibly material what the upfront carbon emissions are. However, until you actually have that piece in hand, operational carbon emissions are by far the lion's share of the carbon emitted through a building.
Right, so whether we're talking about the upfront carbon or the operational carbon, both play a role in the net zero building initiative, which I know Australia is participating with the World Green Building Council on that. So tell us, how's that going in Australia? What's the interest in net zero carbon buildings, and how do you see the uptake unfolding?
So what we're finding is, you know, to put it clearly, we're finding zero is easier to sell on the consumer side than less. You know, so if we talk in residential and things like that, we launched a new strategy about 2 weeks ago, and it's been very hard in some contexts to sell to non-technical audiences 20% less, 30% less. The house with no bills is infinitely more saleable than 30% less against a standard you don't quite understand. And so one of our large partners, Mirvac in Australia, ran this great house with no bills national competition, you know, so for an efficient house powered by renewables, but kind of captured the nation's attention. And what we do in, you know, some of those asset classes like residential very much transfers to other parts of the marketplace. So in Australia, there's been almost an obsession with efficiency in buildings for the last decade. We've had some regulatory requirements on mandatory disclosure that actually, it's not the same, but it's quite close to what you're bringing in New York. So it's worth unpacking those. So we've had a national efficiency obsession for a while. And we do have, you know, some of the strongest uptake of rooftop solar. We have some very large solar projects in our grid that are actually driven by the large owners. And we have large power purchasing agreements where people can buy across our portfolio. So when those elements have come together, there's a massive focus on net zero in our marketplace. So at the moment, we have 16 groups signed up to net zero for 2030 as a commitment across all their buildings, including our largest bank in Australia, one of our largest university campuses, but across to some of our consultants. At the moment with our landlords, what we're finding is we have all of our biggest landlords committing, but sometimes it's one fund at a time. Sometimes it's the fund where they own everything that they've committed first, and then they're moving across their portfolio, doing deals with their other partners. So yeah, for us, this is a really seminal moment. And within our tool Green Star for our world leadership buildings, from our new tool we're launching this year, you'll have to have a net zero building in operation that's fossil fuel free to be able to claim world leadership, because that's where we think the future's going.
Now, a big part of net zero is renewable. We talked about it. So in New York, we're renewably constrained. We literally have a bottleneck, and we don't have the transmission capability today to get additional renewable capacity into New York. That's being solved, but it's going to take some time. What does the renewable picture look like in Australia? Is it an asset for you to help to get to zero net carbon, or is it still a challenge?
So when it depends which asset type. Like you, there's certain parts, when you're in densely populated cities, there are some deep constraints. But when you're outside of those cities, we find renewables an asset. So prior to being the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia, I was the General Manager of Sustainability and Corporate Procurement at one of the large property owners called Stockland. And we ran a really large renewables program as a profit-making enterprise. So we're running double-digit, return figures. I like to tell the development team that we were doing better than the development numbers. And we were running that around the country, but particularly in locations where we had access to large unshaded roofs. So whereas for us, if you're looking at city assets, you're looking at power purchasing agreements. So buying into large renewable farms and either doing that as a direct purchase or as a corporate hedge against your solar pricing. And that market is actually quite mature in Australia. The challenge that we're going through at the moment is making sure that our grid has sufficient storage capacity for the ebbs and flows of different energy types, which is a very big focus area for our grid at the moment.
So the renewable makeup of New York State, and increasingly for New York City, is going to be a combination of hydropower and offshore wind. Is it mostly solar in Australia, or are there other components to renewables that come to play?
So at the moment, we have a large government hydro project that's within the grid. Most of the grid that's supplied is coal, and then individual cohorts are looking to offset it with some wind, but large amounts of renewables, large amounts of solar.
Great. Now, you mentioned government initiatives like that with mandatory disclosure. So what's the what's the position of the government today on low carbon issues, and what role do you think the government can play in market transformation?
I think this is a really interesting question. And the Australian market was shaped very much in the office space by an early movement from the government in 2006, where we have an energy efficiency rating called NABERS. I think it's close to your Energy Star. However, ours has slightly more constraints and a lot of rigor in it. So the government actually said that they wouldn't, in 2006, that they wouldn't occupy any buildings that fell below what was at the time 4.5 star, that was high for us in that marketplace at the time. Now at that time they were 30% of the leasing market, and more, and in jurisdictions like our national capital, were above 50%. And so that was a huge driver in the office space. And so the market first started looking at where you had government as a tenant, and then noting that they were 30% of the market, noted they could be a tenant there at any time. And so that procurement initiative really set a tone. And at that time, renewables weren't on the picture at all. It really started properties' obsession with efficiency, whether it be lighting upgrades, whether it be air conditioning upgrades, huge amounts of work on sub-metering, building automation, building tuning, absolutely a huge focus. And then the next piece that came in 2010, so it's been in for a decade, is what we call mandatory disclosure, which is similar to what you're saying, which is where every building is required to disclose its carbon, disclose its score rating, and actually put it right on the advertising banner out the front when you're leasing or selling any building. And so we've seen huge market transformation out of that. The thing that we were saying was, okay, the leaders use this tool, how's everyone else going to go? The thing that was really interesting in our context is everyone else actually did better than the leaders when they started, because the leaders had gone out and trained the supply chain across industry. And so, you know, when they turn around to their contractors and said, I need to pull 20% energy out of this building, they said, yep, we know how to do that. Here's the plan, here's the pieces of it, and actually sort of broke that down into key steps. So there've been a couple of the long-standing initiatives. We probably have a similar item to you, where we're actually seeing far more pull at a city level. You know, so in our City of Sydney, the planning requirements that are mandated by the City of Sydney Council are actually higher than those mandated in the federal scheme. So although each state and territory has a net zero for 2050 commitment, and although we're a signatory to the Paris Agreement, we did have one of our politicians comment the other week that they're not sure federally whether we have a net zero 2050 component. So we have the same multi-pull, and you know, one of the reasons that you know, Australia is a global leader on GRESB, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, or the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. One of the drivers has been that when there were challenges and there wasn't clear and coherent policy frameworks in the long term, industry clubbed together through both the Property Council and through ourselves to kind of map their own long-term carbon trajectory. And what we're finding is, as the leaders in industry pave the way, our building codes are following us. So we had a 35% increase in our mandatory code for everything aside from residential in the last year, partly demonstrated by what the leaders showed they could do on efficiency.
So I've always admired Australia for its leadership in this area, and often the marketplace in Australia has moved much faster than other parts of the world. What are the drivers for that? I mean, what is motivating and driving the early action in property owners and developers?
Look, I think we've kind of got the Goldilocks conditions, I could refer to it. We're the right size market potentially, where we're large enough to have scale of, you know, property portfolios, but we're actually small enough that a lot of the key market players know each other. So, you know, when we talk to partners in the US and we say we'd like to make a change in industry, so we just get all of industry around a very large table and argue about it, that wouldn't be possible in the same way in the States. And the way that the key sustainability organisation, ourselves, the Green Building Council, leans in and partners with our property equivalent, the Property Council of Australia, it shocks a lot of people globally, but particularly in America, when I say we hold shared advocacy positions on sustainability with the Property Council. And in fact, we actually have a shared advocacy resource for how we talk to government on sustainability. But I do think having long-term efficiency drivers and having our property rental market driven for the last 15 years really by the most efficient building actually wins the day. You know, both in terms of 30% of our market directly with government leasing, but actually because it's required to be on the front page in certain scale font of every lease deal, how efficient you are, that has actually gone through our entire market discussions about sustainability and efficiency in that place.
As your grid becomes more renewable, as we discussed, is there a move in Australia to electrify, to get you know, heat, for example, off of carbon-based sources? It's a huge issue for us in New York. You know, 40% of our carbon emissions in New York come from burning a fossil fuel at a building, typically large multifamily, for heat or hot water. It's greater than all transportation combined in New York City. So it's a huge issue that we're grappling with, and we're hoping as our grid becomes greener, electrification is the answer to that. Are there things that we could learn from Australia on this journey?
I think you could learn how controversial it is. So, but I think the other piece that it's worth learning is setting out, when we started doing our carbon positive roadmap, to be frank, for a while it was just all of industry arguing about different views. But now we actually launch an annual view of our carbon positive roadmap, and we update industry's views in these areas. But for us, it goes to 2030. And it actually sets out in meaningful terms what we'll advocate for, what we'll seek to do. So the thing that we found on electrification was, once all of industry worked out that we're really trying to turn to renewables, and you couldn't have a net zero building with gas unless you had a lot of offsets, and that embeds in other challenges. So for new buildings, we've been highly committed to renewables. The same people who, when we published the first version of the carbon positive roadmap, said that it couldn't be done, are now out advocating with clients and partners for how they're implementing solutions. So I think really considering this one as a change process, because it changes kind of the entire ethos of long-term sustainability. If you don't have a lot of renewables in your grid, gas is obviously a lower carbon form of production. So you have some of the same people that were implementing trigeneration a decade ago to lower your carbon emissions coming back and trying to remove gas boilers. So I think it's worth recognising that, as well as a technical shift, that this is a really big change journey. And I knew that we were having quite a lot of change when I was summoned by the head of one of the gas distributors to see what our plans were, because all of their big clients were they were starting to receive all these requests to have new buildings not connected to gas. And so the piece that we didn't fully comprehend was that by seeking to electrify buildings in some jurisdictions, we'd be breaking the law. So this first came up in one of our jurisdictions where one of our large communities looked at the IPCC. They were in a large location where they could have a community that wasn't overshadowed. And so what they absolutely sought to do was put in large amounts of renewables and electrify. Now, hilariously, in this scenario, the gas company had a legal right to put gas in the road, so they did. So the developer asphalted over the top of it. Didn't connect it to any of the buildings. And so there was this large controversy when this project went through. But what happened was, the next day, within 6 months, there was a legislative change that developers in that jurisdiction didn't have to put in gas if they were doing it for appropriate reasons, appropriately consulted. And that for us is setting a pathway. We're slowly going to see that move around the nation, and that's absolutely going to be amplified with one of our tools that says, to be a leadership building, you have to be fossil fuel free. And so a lot of our focus is in electrification. Now, fascinatingly, at the same time, parts of the gas network after this movement are actually doing the move to green gas, which industry's been advocating for a decade. But suddenly, the impetus of a number of developers seeking to remove their buildings from gas has actually led to some of the supply chain change that we had previously said was impossible in that part of the sector.
So for the audience, I just have a couple more quick questions for Davina, then we'll turn it over to audience questions. Make sure you have questions, submit them in the chat box, and Caitlin will be organizing those. Davina, the COVID-19 impact on sustainability in Australia, positive or negative?
Well, I think anyone will tell you it's kind of too early to make calls. What we can see is we can see some really strong threads. Now, before I start this, I have to actually acknowledge that Australia is far less COVID impacted than the States. And, our heart goes out to you. Your heart went out to us in the bushfires. Our heart absolutely goes out to you. So just to kind of give some context, Australia has approximately 7,000 cases of COVID-19. We had something like 10 new cases yesterday, and we have just over 100 deaths. So our context is different to yours, and I feel it's important to acknowledge that. But it's meant a lot of the same things. We've been you know, my office has been working remotely for, I think we're in our 10th week. And so I think when we start to unpack some of the things that have changed, some of those changes are going to be enduring. So I think one of the best expressions that I've had is it's going to usher in the fourth industrial revolution. The one thing you can't say at the end of this is that we can't have large cohorts of people working at home. And so I think the office is going to be fundamentally changed forever. We're going to be using it for the things that it's great at, which is sort of, you know, ultimately going to be a collaboration, a workshop, and interaction space. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen a great webinar where we can argue, you know, like a lot of great breakthroughs come through when we have cohorts of 10 or more having an argument and it really forming into a consensus. I kind of see virtual meetings as a spinning top. And if it goes too far, you kind of push the top off the table and you have to sort of start again. So there's obviously, you know, humans by nature are social creatures. One of the things that we did is we had a policy position, every building counts, where we're trying to talk to federal, state and local level about where we needed their help on sustainability. We were going through some consultation with some, you know, with our elected leaders, and they said, look, there's a pandemic, we can't really talk right now. And so what we did was we sort of flipped this into a COVID-19 response about how do we deliver stimulus and roles through a new green economy. And the same officials immediately called us back and invited us to speak to their COVID task force. So I think for the sustainability world, it's really important to be relevant and on point about how the same messages really need to come out differently in this time. And so some of the specific things that we were discussing is if you're going to fast track planning to keep parts of the economy going as we transition through this, if you're going to fast track planning, you should be asking for more accountability on sustainability outcomes and actually have a way of verifying those. So that's sort of been a key part of our discussion. On the bigger picture for sustainability, there's been a number of advocates that have been really concerned as we get to the end of this, you know, does everyone sort of ditch sustainability and really just focus on jobs for a while? What does that mean? And the thing that I would actually say is there's a global understanding of vulnerability in the way that there has never been. So a challenge for environmentalists or those in the sustainability movement for decades has been, we've been describing that we might get to the end of the energy system or peak oil. We might get to the end of the biodiversity system. Climate change may have impacts of spectacular proportions. And a part of our audience would really just look at us and say, but I've seen so much progress, technology will sort that out. And one thing that I look back on is we use the World Economic Forum's top 10 global risks and impacts. And we like to show people that 6 out of the 10 relate to sustainability issues. Guess what was also on the list and, you know, slightly underutilized off that list? A global pandemic was number 10 on that list. And if either of us had tried to tell someone a year ago there could be a global pandemic, we'd say we have the World Health Organization, we have all of our hospitals, technology, there'll be a vaccine, we've got this. And so I think for the sustainability movement, there's a lot greater understanding of vulnerability and the fact that our systems can't actually cope with everything. So I think the opportunity for us to use is the forced time of introspection to actually reposition how do we have a green launch out of this? Because when we consider it for ourselves in phases, we talk about a protect phase, which, you know, the world has been in for the last couple of months. What do hospitals look like? What do stimuluses look like to make sure people have food for tomorrow? This kind of pivot phase that I feel like we're in now. How do we do our usual business in a very different way? So a webinar like the one we're on now, or, you know, your conference coming up in June, how we pivot, how do we support our workforce, how do we keep them productive remotely? And then we're saying that the last stage is the rebound, so the protect, pivot, rebound. I think it's really useful for people to step back and think about what their sustainability game plan is through those 3 phases, because the responses are really quite different.
Great. I want to squeeze in one last question. but I want you to answer in 20 words or less so we can get to the audience questions. So this is a tradition that I ask on this program. You know, this Urban Green Live is about our zero carbon future. So Davina Rooney, how do we get to a zero carbon future?
We have to sell to the masses highly efficient buildings powered by renewables, and we have to make that sexy and saleable.
All right, that's a great answer. Caitlin, why don't we open it up to audience questions?
Absolutely. This first question is, can you tell us more about some of the strategies in the tambourine bucket? Which audiences do you think have the most capacity to make useful change?
I love this. I love talking about the tambourine because I actually think that we talk a lot about the carrot and the stick, which are kind of blunt instruments. So what I might do is I'll give a carbon example of this. So for example, Green Star or LEED or any of those are like the carrot. And often they go with green planning incentives or requirements in leases, you know, so that's the carrot bucket. When we look at carbon, I would say the stick is minimum regulation, you know, what your code says. However, the carrot and the stick are related. The higher the leaders go, that allows the baseline to move up with them. And often the leadership examples in the carrot are what builds the business case for this. The tambourine are programs where we actually celebrate things like the Embodied Carbon report or our carbon positive roadmap. Or in the Australian market, we use the Net Zero Leaders program as a bit of a tambourine. And if anyone, anytime we talk about what we're partnering in this space and how we amplify people's great work and actually seek to try and create the echo of the leaders. And then we ask the leaders to use their own voice to create that echo or the tambourine ricochet. So I see a lot of the work that Urban Green does as, you know, you work really closely on the carrot and the stick, but how you amplify the voice.
Caitlin, do we just lose Davina? Let's give her a second here.
I'm going to give her a second. I'll contact her from my end. Did you want to add anything to that, John?
Sure. I mean, I think I love this idea of the tambourine and haven't really thought about it that way, but you know, that is an appropriate role for Urban Green to play. I mean, we have to celebrate the success. You know, often it is about the carrot and the stick, and we need those too. I mean, we need the strong regulatory baselines, but it seems like we're always then reaching for the next and the next and the next. It's really important to, you know, celebrate success along the way because success breeds success, and that'll bring more people on the journey as we move forward on the sustainability front. You know, we've seen that in New York. You know, the progression that we've made leading up to Local Law 97 and the strong carbon reductions that we need. You know, now it's time to really focus on, you know, how we can celebrate those that are doing it and getting there. And so more importantly, so others can learn about it. So those are case-based studies that, you know, we're encouraging be done and, you know, we'll give life to and bring them forward in the marketplace.
Hi, John, can you hear me?
Oh, I can. Great. Davina's back. Super.
Fantastic. John, when you gave me an audio dial-in in case we had a technical issue, I laughed and now I'm using it. So I'll stay on audio and then I'll re-log in via the computer. I love that we never have any technical issues until we absolutely go live in wonderful conferences like these. That's
right. Well, we can hear you very, very clearly. So, Caitlin, why don't we move to the next question for Davina?
Sure. So, given the proximity of wildfires in Australia, which makes up climate change very tangible, how much do you think that contributes to the speed of uptake?
I think that's a great question, and it's a question that, to be honest, absolutely broke our hearts this summer. So for many of us, we've been terrified that we'd have a summer. Well, even those of us who were most worried didn't envision a summer quite like the one we had. And the thing for us coming out of the last summer was that we were seeing signs that, in addition to the progressive partners, that we were going to be able to take climate change far greater to the masses. And so I think the real challenge for us is, as we go from, one crisis being the bushfires to another being the pandemic, how do we actually continue and create the right level of focus on the long-term items? Once we have defeated COVID, we're actually going to be working with an even far greater threat of climate change. And so I think it really affects our national psyche and will for a long time. But I think we're actually going to see that in Australia in the next 3 to 5 years in what our politicians do in carbon policy, and how we take the work of the leaders in green buildings and actually scale that across the nation.
So Davina, if I could just do a quick follow-up on that. Did the bushfires, which were just horrible, and our hearts go out to everything that we saw, did that create a sense of urgency on climate change, or was there a cognitive dissonance about climate change in the bushfires? How did that play out?
No, there was a huge national engagement. And to be frank, for the climate deniers, or for those who carbon hadn't been a big issue, there was just absolute enormous public backlash. So it was the event of a large enough scale to absolutely engage the populace. So we saw huge public grief and fear, so to sort of put it in context, making it very local, we were less impacted than many in the bushfires, but still I'd be dropping my son to school who was saying, I can't breathe. This isn't normal. It's been like this for weeks. What are you going to do about it? So it's kind of these very personal moments, or I know people who had moved to Australia who questioned for the first time, were they going to be able to stay in Australia? Were they going to need to move? Were we going to be one of the early climate refugees? So it's had a huge impact on the national psyche. There hasn't been any cognitive dissonance, but the time that we were actually going to see that really converted into public action and awareness through public policy. We're having a bushfire royal commission at the moment, but with current global events, it's getting less public discussion than it would otherwise.
Okay. This next question is, most projects in the US don't account for embodied energy at all. What are the first steps that we might need to take to start to incorporate upfront energy into our codes if the industry isn't ready yet?
This is a really good question. And I think it's worth looking at which, I think what we found that was really impactful on our side was actually having one or two of the project leaders, global leaders, do those on important and seminal projects. One sec, I'm just going to swap back to full use here.
Excellent. So one of the key moments in the Australian context was where we had one of our key projects, our Barangaroo project, and it was actually mandated to have a lower embodied carbon. And so we learnt some deep lessons as an industry from one project. And so I think the opportunity here is, before we apply it at scale, to have a tambourine of a project, so to speak. One that is, in this particular project, it was a government tender. So there was an opportunity, many people were bidding for the same project, and how the winning participant differentiated themselves was offering an embodied carbon solution that wasn't available elsewhere in the market. And so by completing this, they won the project, but then provided really critical lessons to the Australian context that have then been used as national and in fact international examples of leadership. And then our role is to use things like our carbon positive roadmap to scale people's understanding of change, and then slowly work into including those in the more traditional rating tools, and then partnering with government for how we'll put them in policy over time. So I think it's really a staged journey. And the thing that we've discovered in this space is there needs to be different partnerships. You need to engage along your supply chain very differently.
Great, thank you. This next question is from Ingrid. What are the Australian federal and local provisions to provide money for these zero carbon requirements for low income communities?
That's a really good question. And at the moment, we're for low income communities, we're trying to get to nearly zero at this stage. So we're having a really interesting partnership at the moment, because our national codes are being reviewed for residential at the moment. And we're trying to make the argument that it's a health and safety argument. Terrifyingly, in our winter that's mild compared to many places in the world, we had a study that 87% of the elderly who presented with hypothermia were indoors. They were found indoors. You know, so it was the buildings. Or we actually have more people in Australia die of cold, of mild cold, than in Sweden, because our buildings, like our homes, are, you know, we like to joke, they're less well sealed than your average tent. And so it's really important for us. We're making our entire push for the residential code based on the health and well-being of vulnerable Australians, and really seeking to make the case that if we don't implement minimum standards, it is the most vulnerable that are impacted the most highly. And so this is really critical in our thinking. And we're noting that the first version of our construction code that came out for consultation was imagining net zero and buildings. It was buildings that were highly efficient, and that there was the same amount of renewables either on the house or in the grid to offset their contribution, noting that energy poverty disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable. That's a really great question. We hadn't unpacked that so far today.
Great. Along the similar guidelines, how much did it matter that Australia changed policies at a national level? We aren't going to get federal policies requiring net zero buildings in our immediate future. Do you think that changing laws at the city and/or state level could make up for that?
Yeah, I've been really inspired by the New York example. I would have to say, you know, people who know Australia well talk about the climate wars that we've had for the last decade. This may seem familiar. A previous politician, a previous Prime Minister, in fact, had made the position that there needed to be a war on climate to differentiate from the left and right, so to speak. And so had deliberately sought to have wars in this area that, you know, played well across the newspapers. So we have experienced the similar discord that you've seen. But I think there's a few lessons that we've learned in that time. One is the business of government, or the bureaucracy, is absolutely with us, and with us on the science. And so we've had to work very differently for how we partner for change. So sometimes when we're looking about enhancements about code, all of our commentary talks about the business case and the economic impact of reducing energy. We talk about the subsidies that the most, you know, vulnerable receive and their health and safety. So we use a really different language. And when we go into some of those discussions, we never reference net zero buildings. We talk about highly efficient buildings and how much more cost effective they'd be if they were powered by renewables. So there's a piece of that. I'm really heartened to see the cities movement, whether it's C40, what New York's doing, or really importantly, how New York is reaching out to partner with 5 cities around the globe. I actually think in this new world, the new world of Brexit, of the populist leaders, that we actually are going to have more consensus at a city level, and that it can be really impactful to see change one city at a time, or a consensus of cities, because interestingly, often their leadership, you know, particularly in leading cities, often they've got very stable long-term leadership, particularly on the business of government side, and, you know, have really shown some long-term planning. And also when we look at climate resilience, when things go wrong, it's the cities or your governors who really come to the forefront. I don't think that's ever been clearer than in the current crisis. And there's no way you can spin your way out of the kind of, you know, physical disasters that are being seen. And so I think it's those that have the accountability for climate resilience who are going to be most bold in their statements. And I think that we need to support and partner with those areas. Sometimes we don't realise that we actually have the most compelling policy research, even more than sometimes those city levels. So leaning into those discussions can be really impactful.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more questions here if anyone wants to submit anything else. I heard you talk about wellness and low carbon as value propositions of green buildings rather than return on investment. Was there a shift in thinking about this, or has the conversation always been this way?
I think that's a really good question. I think what I would actually say is that we try to inspire people with a value proposition at the start, and then we win it with a return on investment in the business case. So I worked for a property owner for a decade. We used to boast that we were, you know, when I left, we're over $90 million worth of savings in deferred bills. All of our projects exceeded hurdle rates, and we used to make a really big return on investment argument. However, when we talk to a wider audience, outside of the people that control the spreadsheets, I think we have to be able to present a compelling vision or a value proposition for tomorrow, because people often make emotional decisions that they then back justify. So I think we both have to have, for a long time in sustainability, the return on investment was enough. I think we need to actually have both a value proposition that we sell to the broader populace and a return on investment that we write on the business case. And I think without that compelling value proposition, we don't get a seat at the biggest tables or get the broadest audience discussions. These are great questions. I love this.
Well, I think that is our last question for the day. John, is there any final question that you have?
No, I just want to thank Davina. Thank you so much for getting up early to join Urban Green Live. You can go have breakfast now. We really appreciate the informative discussion, and I want to thank you and all of your colleagues at the great organization of Green Building Council of Australia for everything that you're doing for sustainability, not only in Australia, but the examples that you're setting for the rest of the world are really, really important. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.
Fantastic. Such a privilege to be with you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Well, and I want to thank the audience too for the super questions that you had. You know, today is a great example of the work that we do at Urban Green. We take on the biggest challenges with the biggest solutions so we can have the biggest impact. And we do that through our 4 key activities. We convene, we research, we advocate, and we educate. And so I encourage you to check us out at urbangreencouncil.org if you'd like to learn more about us. And so thank you very much. We appreciate you joining Urban Green Live today. Look on our website for future episodes that will be coming up in the coming months. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you.